Essentially, it boils down to culture. Culturally, I don't believe that China has anything to offer the world, and the reason for that is because the vast majority of national cultures are not Confucian. You see, in Chinese society, the Confucian paradigm or Confucian hierarchy represents the core structure of most human relationships. Take a company, for example. You have a group of people at the top who work within this rigid chain of command. They exert total control over the people below them, and believe that benevolence will be taken as a sign of weakness, and that underlings will only take advantage of this. So a lot of time is spent maintaining this pecking order. The upshot is inefficiency and a lack of coordination. In the lower echelons, you have the employees who are unwilling to report on inefficiency or even make suggestions. That would only threaten the hierarchy, which is to say, make those at the top appear incompetent, thereby marking the employee as a troublemaker. The result is organizations working across purposes. Of course, this exists in the West too, but in the Chinese world it's pervasive. So much time is spent on keeping everyone in line. There are dozens of reasons why China will never rule or even exert a tangible influence on the world, but the fact that Chinese society is built around the Confucian paradigm is probably the most obvious one. Confucianism is patently incompatible with the Western way of doing things, and for better or worse, the world is still Western-led. China's economic gains are very impressive, and I don't think there's any arguing with those numbers. But I do think that it's important to bear in mind that 60% of production in China is still foreign-controlled, and that number shoots up to 85% if we're talking high-tech production. And also, of course, the average Chinese worker still only makes a fraction of what they would in the United States. Of course, you could argue that other statistics outweigh such details, but China's great rise is always contextualized as something that transcends economics. When these so-called China experts claim that we'll all be marching to the Chinese beat, they're talking about culture, mindset, education, and so on. The message seems to be that China has something to teach the world, although what that is never articulated. I would argue that China doesn't have anything to teach anybody. Well, if you look at most books that claim that China is going to rule the world or shake the world or what have you, they're largely theoretical, with various chapters constructed around certain topics and lots of charts and figures and whatnot thrown in. You may come away with information, but I don't think that it will bring you any closer to understanding China's essence or even its direction. To do that, you need to view China from the ground. What does China look like, smell like, feel like? What do the Chinese themselves say? How do they respond to nosy Westerners? What's the texture of their social fabric? The idea was to supplement my on-the-ground experience and observation with key information about Chinese history, culture, and the national psyche in order to let the reader understand what China has been and what it is. The reader is then left to make a reasonably informed prediction as to what it will likely become. I originally got the idea by reading Paul Theroux's Riding the Iron Rooster by Train Through China, written in the mid-1980s. I thought I should do something like that, only thesis-driven, updated, and sprinkled with historical facts that I'd been collecting during my 10 years spent in Taipei, Taiwan. I was also inspired, if that's the right word, by another book I read, whose title I won't mention, but where the author travels through the heart of the dragon or something like that to show us this modern-day China on the go. In addition to not being particularly engaging, I didn't find it particularly honest. There's hardly any mention of anything being shabby or out of order, which to my way of thinking is sort of like traveling through Siberia in the middle of January and not mentioning that it's cold. I thought I'll do something vaguely like the Thoreau book and nothing at all like this other one. For one, I think that there are only a handful of people who could have written a book like this. In order to come to a deep understanding of the Chinese world, you need to live in and study it for a protracted period of time. But most people who do that come to accept it and even admire it Either that or they're unwilling to express criticism because it might not be in their best interest to do so. It might tarnish their social standing, for example. But luckily, I didn't have any social standing, so I felt free to investigate and come to any sort of academic conclusion I might happen to reach. I also think that it has to do with political correctness and cultural relativism, neither of which I subscribe to. And if I subscribe to either of them, I couldn't write anything at all. It's become unpopular to criticize foreign cultures, a kind of throwback to the colonial era, for example. But Western philosophy teaches us that we are free to scrutinize any subject. I talk about Socratic questioning or the Socratic method and how it spawned the scientific method. I then juxtapose this against the teachings of Confucius in order to illustrate how, at their roots, Western and Chinese philosophy are antipodian or incompatible. The debate about whether China is or isn't going to rule the world is a fascinating one, because on the one hand you've got a small group of people prophesying China's imminent global domination, a much larger group subscribing to this, or at least acknowledging China as a major future global power, and virtually no one challenging the merits of these propositions. To give you an example, one prominent writer has said that China is going to lead the way because the Han Chinese are racially unique. But isn't every race of people unique? And has it been proven that success is based on or determined by race? Imagine if an intellectual in the West were to argue that a Western country were going to rule the world because its citizens were racially unique. Socrates teaches us that all exhortations, dogmas, opinions, and propositions must be held up to a very bright light. Saying that China is going to rule the world because its citizens are racially unique, or because it's a civilization state and not a mere nation state like the other 194 nation states on the face of the earth, is really emblematic of the kind of mythomania that tends to cloud the China debate. I think that the topic of China is riddled with myths, so I attempt to dispel those myths while enlightening the reader as to the truth behind them. And the truth is always much more interesting than the myth itself. I talk about, for example, what really happened at Tiananmen Square in 1989. I talk about how there really isn't a Great Wall, or that how China has never been a peace-loving or harmonious society, or that China and Taiwan were not split in a civil war. I think that the Chinese, and in particular the Chinese government, invent and perpetuate such myths, but unfortunately so do some Western observers. Oh, sure. And when I liked something, I made sure to mention it. I like the cities of Nanjing and Beijing, and I like the Northeast quite a lot. However, like is not the same thing as can objectively determine how the West might benefit from doing things the Chinese way. China as a subject is fascinating, but as for its particular take on how a society ought to be assembled, I think that it leaves a lot to be desired. It's important to bear in mind that that China is still a totalitarian country, one that doesn't even meet the definition of a developed nation. And not all the "Wow, look at China go" books out there can alter that. I think that if Western people want to really understand China, they're going to have to stop exoticizing it. I mainly like historians such as Jonathan Femby and Jonathan Spence, but I also like Peter Hessler a lot too. He writes intelligent, informed, and honest stuff, and I think it's good for people because they don't have to wade through 800-page Mao biographies in order to understand what's gone on in China and why it is the way it is. I'm not sure, but I hope to continue to write about travel, using it as a springboard to talk about history and culture and so on. In my opinion, there's nothing better than reading a well-penned, well-researched, intelligent travel narrative. I've written a travel narrative about my home country of Canada, and I hope to have that published in a year or two. And I'd like to write a novel set in my hometown of St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. To my knowledge, no one's ever done that before.